The next and final time period of our course is 1900 to the present. Starting with the beginning of the 20th century gives us ample opportunities to discuss the fate of what we've dug into so much this year, the nature and fate of empire. With this first topic, shifting power after 1900, we are really interested in being able to explain how internal and external factors contributed to change in various states after 1900. So by internal factors, we could be talking about things like famine, poor government, a failure to industrialize, and so on. And for external factors, we could be looking at war, conquest, outside interference, etc. Those are probably some things you want to jot down. The first thing we need to know is really something we should keep in mind for this whole time period of 1900 to the present. The fact that the Western-dominated political order will eventually dissolve throughout the 20th century. And the first symptoms of that will begin in the first part of the century and continue through World War I. To help you get a feeling for what I mean, here is a map of Afro-Eurasia. And we can see the years that each nation state gains its independence. So we can see the collapse over time of these empires. To begin, we're going to examine the collapse of three older land-based empires, the Ottoman, the Russian, and the Qing. These three collapses had both internal and external factors that contributed to their demise, so please try and keep up with those. All right, let's dig in to the end of the Ottoman Empire. The last time we checked in with the Ottoman Empire in Unit 6, they were experiencing nationalist threats that led to more and more states starting to break away. Two major reform groups emerged, the Young Turks and the Young Ottomans, that tried to salvage the empire with a constitution, but different definitions of what it meant to be an Ottoman. So here, we're beginning to see some internal challenges. Particularly, we have different ethnic groups demanding self-determination and the increasing tension that comes with trying to hold together their pretty old multi-ethnic empire. And here in this map, you can see the dates of when different states start to break away. For example, even before World War I, which we know eventually puts an end to the Ottoman Empire, we can see how much animosity and resentment was increasing in various parts of their empire. If we look at this Arab member of the Ottoman parliament, right, he starts complaining essentially that there aren't a lot of Arabs represented, even though the constitution decrees just and equal treatment among the different elements of the empire. So he's starting to feel pretty resentful over the fact of the lack of Arab representation. Plus, you'll remember that Ottoman attempts at modernizing and industrializing their economy and military had been only moderately successful and had faced a lot of steep critiques and a lack of interest from the elites. To this, we're going to add a punishing loss in World War I, and the empire will not survive it. Take a few moments here to go ahead and look over the costs of World War I for the Ottoman Empire. Moving on to our second dead empire, let's examine the collapse of the Qing. You'll remember that in the 19th century, it really didn't go well for the Qing. Between losing the Opium Wars, humiliating treaties with the European powers, and a devastating civil war, they had endured ending the century by losing to Japan and then the failed Boxer Rebellion. The 19th century definitely left some marks. Couple that with a failure of self-strengthening, and the Qing are not looking good in the eyes of their people. Let's look at some documents to see if we can attribute the blame internally or externally. So we'll start here with Karl Marx. Karl Marx, who we know what he's famous for. Here is an article he's writing called Revolution in China and in Europe. Right, and he's talking about, we can see in that first sentence, the formidable revolution that's taking place in China has unquestionably been caused by the British cannon forcing upon China the unlimited importation of opium. So he is going to blame external factors. Pause the video, read the rest of the document, see what else you can see that Marx is saying. Here, a Chinese source, a Revolutionary Proclamation of 1907, right, he is going to, or this group rather, is going to blame the Manchu, right, an alien race, the Manchu. So make sure you pause, read this document, see what you can find in terms of internal versus external causes for collapse. So let's talk about it. In the crumbling mess of the early 20th century, the best the Qing dynasty has to offer is the ancient empress Cixi, seen here on the right, whom you'll remember from a document we saw where she had embezzled industrialization funds for a renovated palace. And she is working to support a kind of distant relative of hers, who is Puyi, seen here on the left. And he is a child and also the final Qing emperor. So you can kind of draw some conclusions about how desperate the Qing are getting. So as the criticism of the Qing's failure to handle all of their problems start to move more closely towards rebellion, Puyi, he's 6 at the time, is pushed into exile. And the hopeful ideas of Dr. Sun Yat-sen, who we'll look at in the next slide, seen here, Dr. Sun Yat-sen in 1911, his ideas are carried forward in a revolution that topples the Qing dynasty. The next decade is really unsettled in China as it tries to find its footing in a post-dynastic world. There's World War I to deal with. There's the aftermath of all of that. They're not very happy with how the Versailles Treaty goes. And the 3 principles of Dr. Sun Yat-sen, you can see his writing. He is very kind of famous within China. He's very famous in the West at the time too. And you can see this book on the right is titled The Unfinished Revolution, right? So thinking about what that implies. All of this unsettledness in the beginning of the 20th century will set the stage for the civil war that rampages through China in the 1920s and the 1930s, then World War II, and the Communist Revolution that will follow in 1949. We're going to go ahead and move on to Russia. They are our final land-based empire that we need to discuss. So, like the other two, we'll need to parse through both internal and external factors. Like the Ottoman, for example, World War I will play a large role, but also like the Qing, failures at reform from an established dynasty will also play a role. Let's go ahead and see what the documents tell us, and I'll expand from there. So here we have Leo Tolstoy, who's a famous Russian novelist. He is writing this to the Tsar and his assistants. It's an open letter, though, so everybody will get to see it. Go ahead and pause, read through, see what type of internal or external factors you can find. Okay, so I hope you saw that Tolstoy is really blaming the government, and the fact that the government has not adopted, it's too autocratic, it's too totalitarian, and there's not a lot of give or representation. He says, failed to abandon its despotic methods. Here, George Buchanan, who's the British ambassador, he is publishing this in 1923 in a memoir. Go ahead and pause, read through, see what you can find in terms of internal and external factors. Again, we start to see some internal factors, right? We know, for example, that there was an attempt at industrialization, but that failure at reforms to increase the participation of the people really didn't help, right? There's the revolution of 1905 that doesn't go well. And of course, in World War I, there are bread riots and worker shortages that the government is incapable of handling. Which leads us to the revolution. Tsar Nicholas II is going to abdicate in March 1917 in what's called the February Revolution, because the Russian calendar is different than our calendar. So it takes place in Russia in February, but for us in March. A provisional government is eventually created after this happens to help transition Russia. But over the summer of 1917, Russia is still having a horrible time in World War I, which gives more and more popularity to this man seen here, who is Vladimir Lenin, and his political party of communist revolutionaries known as the Bolsheviks. Their motto is bread, land, and peace. So it's super popular at the time. And they actually decide that they're popular enough to go ahead and overthrow the provisional government in October of 1917 in what's known as the October Revolution. It's actually just a small group of Lenin and his followers, like a dozen of them, who make this call. It is not actually widely supported, but they are convinced, they've convinced themselves that they are popular. So the new communist Russia is going to be embroiled in a civil war between communists and anti-communists, but the Communist Party, led by Lenin here, is able to negotiate a separate peace and remove itself from the war. Lastly, we need to know that challenges to the existing political order occur in the Western Hemisphere as well. And as an example of that, we are going to talk about Mexico and how the system established after independence, what we would call the status quo, and that system that's very reminiscent of colonial times under Spain continued to be a problem. Similar to Russia, Mexico had a large working and peasant class that didn't have a lot of rights, representation, or property ownership. They'd been governed by the same dictatorial president named Porfirio Diaz for over 30 years. He had no intention of stepping down, and things were not great, as we can see in this document. So let's go ahead and pause the video and take a few minutes to read it. In the document, we can see that the government of Porfirio Diaz is not interested in helping the people. In fact, he basically blames them, or at least his finance minister blames him for their own problems. And so there's not a lot of sympathy for the majority of Mexicans. In the early 1900s, there are a variety of attempts to either challenge Diaz in the election or just actually overthrow him. However, all of these attempts fail. But a movement is able to form and increased demands for land redistribution occur. This is very similar to what we see happen in Russia, where the Bolsheviks promise land to the peasants, and that land will come from the aristocrats. We can see how popular the demand for the kind of redistribution of land is in this 1911 editorial called The Right of Property, right? So, think about that. It says in the second paragraph, the return of the land to the peasants should be accomplished. And that the revolutionaries will not be committing a crime by turning over land to the working people. So this seems to definitely be something that is driving this revolution. In this document, the plan of San Luis Potosí, by one of the challengers to Porfirio Diaz, we can see kind of the continued challenge to the government that is ongoing. However, the hero of this movement for land redistribution and revolution in Mexico is Emiliano Zapata, seen here in this print. He, along with Pancho Villa and the support of the U.S. government, are eventually able to oust the corrupt and dictatorial Diaz and put new leaders in place, and they write a new constitution in 1917. And you can see here, it's Tierra y Libertad, so land and freedom. So again, this emphasis on land redistribution. On this slide here, we can see the new constitution that is created and adopted in 1917. Among it, right, slavery is forbidden. Every person shall enjoy the guarantees. They shall be neither abridged nor suspended. No person shall be prevented from engaging in any profession. So there's a lot of rights. It's actually one of the first constitutions to guarantee social rights as well as political rights, which makes it very interesting. Unfortunately, however, the new president doesn't take long to mostly ignore the noble intentions of this constitution, and most of the reforms promised within it are not realized until the election of Lázaro Cárdenas in 1934. So that's from 1917 to 1934. That's another 17 years of not actually having the freedoms guaranteed to them. So as we close this, I want us to think about the collapse of empire and revolting against empire and thinking about if they seem to be worth it. Do they really achieve what they mean to achieve? Are the causes that they represent worth dying for? Because a lot of people seem to die in the wars and the struggles and the conflicts that emerge, and not a lot of reforms seem to take place, right? Basically, in none of these four places do we see an effective revolution or the effective instituting of the reforms that they claim to represent.